Everybody see my screen? All right, I'm sharing the right screen. All right. Let's see. Is Jose on? I think he is yet. I haven't seen anything that indicates that we are not. No, we are on track at the moment. Jose already commented. Executing latest on staging. All right. So what's been done this week? So Andreas did a lot of partitioning demos, just the coding part of it, showing what it's going to take to do some actual partitioning schema migrations. You can watch all the videos there. They're very short. I think they span anywhere between 5 and 11 minutes. Great, well-rehearsed presentation. Thank you, Andreas, for that. And the merge request is out there for everybody to take a look at. And then Andreas, you want to give a quick overview, verbalize your comments there?
Yeah, I just want to make sure this is summarized in a sense that it's not a workable solution. So we've been just hacking on this for a day or so, basically using Postgres partitioning and combining that with foreign data wrappers. And that's been fun. That's been good insight as well, but it's not a ready-to-use sharding solution. And since Postgres doesn't support native sharding, this is one of the roads that we're sort of investigating, but it's not a ready-made solution. I just want to make sure this is clear from that point. So it's not a drop-in solution for us, and we are going to need to change the application quite a bit. Even once we have that solution, it still requires application changes. So that's important to know from that point.
Yeah, and we have an issue, a little comment over here, that we will start tracking as we continue on with these prototypes and exploring partitioning, that we can start tracking what application changes we would need to make.
So a quick question. So we looks like we decided this is a technical approach, going down the road. That's the method or technical approach we are going to solve the partitioning issue, the task, right? So yeah, just confirm this is a way that we're going to pursue sharding or partitioning.
So I think we're pretty clear on the partitioning side, so that's well understood, and this is a tool that we can use going forward. For the sharding side of that, so basically the ability to distribute those partitions across many servers, this is not really clear. There is a way of doing that using foreign data wrappers, and that's what we demoed here. But it's totally unclear if that is the path that we should be taking. And even if we did, there is still a lot of challenges in the application left to benefit from that. It sort of replicates what CytosDB does, or it's a similar pattern, I think, in some aspects. And what we also know is that CytosDB is also not a drop-in solution for us. So we're only exploring this at this point. We don't know if that's the right solution for us.
Okay, so now we are working on a partitioning solution or technical spike, but for sharding, we still to be sorted out how to proceed with or how to pursue the sharding solution.
Yes, in a sense, the partitioning step, I think that's a good iteration in the right direction. And I think we should be starting with that. The sharding topic, it can build on top of that, and it can also benefit from the findings that we have in this first iteration, because we already start tackling issues in the application to support the partitioning better, and that also benefits the sharding approach later. So,
thank you. Yeah, no more questions.
I would like to add that it's hard to imagine a situation where sharding will not take us to do heavy changes on the application. Sharding is, after all, is the last resort before all the vertical scaling capabilities have been done, right? And so we need to assume that it's going to be changes to the application. Actually, I would say the more changes we do to the application, whatever that cost time factors may be, the better, because we will be able to do things smarter. Maybe long-term this is not a desirable goal, but since there's no drop-in solution, the more we accept this, probably the better we'll be. Actually, this is very good approach, and I welcome this demo a lot. These demos, I've watched the videos; they're cool. And this is expected. This is exactly what partitioning looks like with Postgres, right? With foreign data wrappers and partitions. Now, the key here is actually, my opinion, is that this part should be the minimal part of the partitioning itself. I mean, this is kind of the worst case. The worst case is that you really need to go through the FTWs to go to partitions on remote servers. But the idea is that, in my opinion, that 80%, 90%, whatever high percentage you can be, is that application will talk directly to the shard it needs to get the data from. Or if we don't want to make the application so much more complicated, to write a proxy layer that will intercept this and know which partition to reference this query. But if most queries will go through the FTWs, not only the challenges that you have found will happen, but also performance problems. Because, for example, foreign data wrappers are not parallel. So if you need to scan, let's say 8 shards, Postgres will do this in sequence, and the lag for that query will be pretty high. So first of all, I would say the application needs to be changed, that all the queries that will touch more than one partition need to be carefully redesigned, understood, or else assume that those will incur in a higher lag, right? But if we can change the application, analyze the application in such a way that, again, 80, 90, whatever percentage of queries can target only a single shard directly, then either through a proxy or directly talking to the shard, we will avoid most of these problems. There's definitely challenges on this, but maybe we need to face them anyway, because there's no drop-in solution or magical, drop something and we'll shard everything for you transparently. That doesn't exist, right?
Yeah, I really agree with that. I think that's, yeah, we already see that when we talk about just partitioning one table in GitLab, we already notice that there are different access patterns, and you want to think about those, because some they work fine with the partitioning approach, and then the other they conflict with that. So how do you deal with that? And we picked a small example where we sort of made that exercise earlier. I think it's crucial for us to figure out what problem we're really trying to solve for. Pick a specific feature where we know that it has scaling issues in the database, where we expect more data to come, and use that example and then provide a solution for that. Maybe partitioning, or likely partitioning, is a good way of approaching that. But I think so far we've been on a very general level discussing sharding solutions, be that Site2be, or be that using foreign data wrappers with Postgres or stuff like that. But in order to iterate on that, and in order to get that going, I think we really should pick a feature that we care about, that we know has scaling problems, and then start with a partitioning implementation and figure out the problems along the way. So I think this is also a product question where we want to invest, or what we know which feature would benefit from that approach. We're currently discussing in that direction as well.
Yeah, and that's what's happening next. So continuing to work on isolating access patterns, and I believe some of those have been added. Yep. Nope, they haven't. So I have a list of them that I will add to this issue so we can further iterate on it. But last week was a light week, and we had the holiday, and most of the database team was in training half the week. So we'll continue to iterate on isolating the access patterns and get a good example we can do the next iteration on. And if there's any other unknowns while we work on partitioning and sharding. Let's jump over to container registry. Dan, you had some questions.
Yeah, I guess, I mean, some of the conversation we've just had has been helpful in answering where we're at and what's going on. So thanks for everyone for discussing that. I think the considerations that I'm trying to weigh up against here is there could be a fair amount of effort to do 2 proofs of concept. One with an fully integrated schema into the existing database. And the idea of having a separate database, as Andreas asks somewhere in here, as a down the list a little bit, that was actually directly discussed with Sid and sort of runs afoul of the idea that we should be a single application, single database, which is why there was some contention around whether we go and create a proof of concept to represent one or the other. The design that I think you linked to here, Andreas, that had been come up with lots of discussion with Jerome and Haley and everyone in the container registry, had led to the point where we decided to go and create a separate database. So that's the thing we already planned out and we're executing against up until we started having discussions about sharding in the long term and application extraction and all of that. My understanding from the discussion we had with Sid last time, I don't remember exactly when that happened, Craig, sorry.
It was a week ago last Friday, so about 10 days ago.
Yeah, and so that the idea is single application, single database, having a separate database doesn't really do that. And I get there are other applications, I get that there are other stuff going on and that's fine, but we're about to go and create this. So I was trying to work out whether we had capabilities that would support an integrated schema, whether an integrated schema would satisfy that integrated schema, a schema in the same database that's separated just for the container registry. There should be no querying across it. But my question fundamentally was that sharding of databases, the sharding of databases containing multiple schemas, is that supported in Postgres 11? And then, Andreas, do you want to verbalize that?
Yeah, so Postgres itself doesn't do any sharding, any native sharding. What you can do is partitioning, and that's unrelated to using schemas or databases. So I think this is a cross-cutting concern in that sense.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So perhaps can we talk about the container registry for a moment?
Yeah.
We're saying that we want a single application, single database. That's kind of a strategy formulation for us. We talk a lot about the database part of that, where we say that, yes, we want one database. And I think there is still a bit of confusion going on with terms. But setting that aside for the moment, I think if we say single application, single database, doesn't that also mean that we put everything into one application? Because so far, we've been talking about the database, we're saying that everything should go into one database. But at the same time, we're sort of heading towards having container registry separate. I'm not saying that's wrong. I think that's the better approach. But we should decide for which direction we want to go. Is it one application, one database, or can it be one application with multiple services that have their own logical database? I think that makes the most sense. But there's I think there's the two different directions that we discuss.
Yeah, and I think that's a good point, Andreas. I agree with that concern. I think we already have separate applications. We already have Gitterly, we have Workhorse, we have Container Registry, we have Runner. We have a bunch of separate applications that are actually written. These are all, did I say all of Golang? I think all of this stuff is Go. It's all written in Go for a reason. I don't think we considered, and I'm sorry, just for a bit of background, we had considered writing Container Registry, replacement for Container Registry into the Rails app. That's not the way we ended up going, and there's a bunch of factors of why, and I think we can get into it if people want, but there's a bunch of reasoning. But we ended up choosing to take the Docker distribution registry and fork that code into our own code, into our own project. That being said, I think at this point, the concern is we can continue diverging from the single application, single database, and it is already something we're using, and it's pluggable, so you can use a different container registry solution. You don't have to use ours. There's a bunch of other factors to it. we can continue diverging, and if we can, I think I'm summarizing Sid's concerns the best I can, but we continue diverging, it becomes harder and harder in future to scale. If we've got all these separate databases, it's harder to maintain, harder to support for our customers, and it's harder to be, it's not as an easy solution as we want it to be, right? Because it's new and this database that we're trying to create doesn't exist yet, that's kind of why it's like, oh, okay, let's not add to this problem by creating yet another one. Let's look at a way we can actually move forward. Go ahead, Andrea, sorry.
I was going to say regarding the scaling issue, I think it's actually the opposite. If we don't cramp everything into one database, we have much better scaling options in the future because we can scale them individually. And what we discussed is making that easy for customers. If they use Omnibus, for example, then those separate databases, they wouldn't even notice because they run on the same database cluster anyway. So it's not that much. It's actually no difference for a customer in terms of complexity, but it would allow us on GitLab.com, for example, to scale those databases individually. So we would have a chance of scaling the Rails database, for example, differently from the container registry, which is a huge opportunity.
So the other piece, scalability and supportability was a concern of Sid's, but the biggest piece and the biggest concern for him was the IACV and selling the single application, single data store. And it's actually in that video, and I'll find the link again, but it was about 14 minutes into the video with Sid from the Friday before last, where we really need to push that single database, single application. And it sounds like we need to get him in the same room with the majority of us so we can talk about what the trade-offs are going to be. To Dan and Joam's point in that issue about container registry, if we need to integrate it into GitLab and to fully support that single database, single application, quantify how much work that's going to be, because it sounded like it was on a scale of months. And correct me if I'm wrong, Dan, if that needs to be integrated into GitLab, and talk about what it means to have a separate application, but calling into a single, oh, thank you for the video link, Sean. Separate application calling into the same database, what the trade-offs are there. And you know, he said it once, I know he'll probably say it again, you know, we can talk theoretical, but till we actually have data or samples of how this actually works, it's still just theoretical. So
well, and that's 100% a good question. I did pose that. There is an issue we created to discuss that, and Joam gave us a really nice explanation of why that's problematic. And I think it comes down to, like, we could do that with as the minimal impact on our deliverables in terms of getting the online garbage collection implemented inside the container registry, which is just for everyone's reference here, container registry storage is 4.1 petabytes right now. And we have no way to clean it up, and it's unbounded growth. So like that's what the online garbage collection is supposed to solve. We've been targeting mid-year, probably end up being August. We have a very small team of people. This would delay that however long it took to implement this inside as a POC. And so my concern here is like, we can implement it very quickly in the same database, but it really doesn't feel like it adheres to the spirit of what Sid's asking for. I think it's doable. We basically have Rails own the schema, have it read only inside the Rails application, because there's no overlap here. This is not shared data across the container registry and what our Rails code would be looking at. It's straight up totally separate. It's internal data structures for the container registry's online garbage collection plan. And so from that perspective, it's a perfect example. Well, I shouldn't say perfect, but I think it's a great example for something where we do application extraction. But if we really do want to sort of tease out what it would cost and how much it would take, how much effort it would take to implement it inside, there's the version of like, yeah, we're just going to put it inside and have Rails manage the schema and have it read only. That's not a huge deal, but it just means it's all these extra tables floating around everywhere. And it's like, it doesn't really feel like it's properly integrated to me. So I'm really concerned that that would end up being just like a throwaway. Yeah, it's integrated. And then you go, why do we do this? Because it's not really adding any value at that point. And so I really just want, I'm kind of concerned about, let me find that issue that Joam created for everyone's reference. That is actually the one you shared above, Andreas, I think. now that I'm looking at. Yeah.
I think if we
Yeah. It's
if
93.
we already sorry
No, you're right. I apologize, Andreas. Go ahead.
if we already know that there is no overlap between those two data sets from the Rails application and the container registry. So those services, they don't need data from each other and cross-join them in a database. I think that's a very clear point of making a separation there, and perhaps also the reason why we would extract that into a separate service in the first place. That typically resembles great when you put it in separate databases and not try to stuff them in the same database. So I don't see a reason not doing that.
Right, and that's 100%, and I agree with that, but that does not address SID's ISCV concerns, right? And those are completely valid. Like as a company, I think it's very important that we remember that we need to make money to be a company and have jobs. I feel I don't mean to be too like goofy with that statement, but it's really important. So if we really feel like this is tied directly to our IACV, then we ought to go look at it. What I'm getting at is that amount of effort, and to get that happening, the smallest possible thing we can do there feels like it's just like, oh yeah, we chucked the schema in. It doesn't help with scale. It is contrary to the other efforts we're trying to push, perhaps, and I would defer to you on Andreas, because you know that better than I do. But that's kind of my big issue here is like, yeah, it's a great case. That's why we ended up kind of choosing that path forward, but that is directly in conflict with the concern around IACV. So how do we square that? And that's kind of my point. I'll stop rambling, sorry.
And I get Andreas's point of, you know, if we do put the schema into the single database, we still have the separate, is it still considered a separate application because the container registry is running in Go and it's not part of the larger Rails application? So does that still fit within SID's vision of single application, single data store? So,
I agree, totally agree. I think what I would sort of thinking, and this only really sort of happened later last week, I think, question mark, maybe I'm just misremembering. 6 days ago, I guess, so like midweek last week, you know, evaluating the need to integrate what would be required and then sort of evaluating whether a proof of concept makes sense in spite of the valid concerns you've raised, Andreas. I don't need to dismiss those at all. Of what would actually be involved and how much energy would that mean. And then on the application integration side, I guess I have the similar question to what you raised, Andreas, which is, do we then integrate it? Do you know, throw out this idea of having a separate container registry and a separate runner and a separate this? If we don't have a case to be made around those things being separate, then they ought not be separate, I suppose, if that's in line with our ICV efforts that Sid's sort of been quite clear about. And if that's the case, there maybe needs to be a broader evaluation. In this particular case, it is a really good example of extracting and being separate, because it is totally separate. So go ahead, sorry.
So what is the impact on AICV for either of those solutions? So why is one better than the other? Like having a single database for them or putting them separate?
So it's IACV, which is incremental annual contract value, which is our ongoing, and just sorry, I use acronyms and we're kind of not supposed to because it's confusing, or it can be confusing. It is for me often, so I apologize for that. I haven't got the quantified numbers from Sid. I think we could get those numbers if we really want to weigh out what it would cost. I think that's a fair question. I don't have an answer for it other than that, Andreas.
Perhaps we can clarify on that one. I feel that we might be making too much of a problem making that decision if it goes into a separate logical database where it lives in the same schema. Because that's not that much of a difference, really. But it's a good way of separating things. But I'm not even sure if that comes with additional effort if we wanted to do that. So I guess I'm saying I'm not fully understanding the concern that we have about that.
So I'd recommend going back and watching the video link that Chen added there. So he really emphasized how much the single application, single data store really drives sales. And if we need him to come in and kind of communicate that again, then I can certainly ask him. For now, I would say let's ping him on the issue here and ask that question. You know, we've got a few different permutations, right? If we insert it as a schema into the existing database, but it still lives in its own Go service, which seems like the simplest iteration that we can do right now, right? Oh, sorry, I need to see Dan's head to see if we're agreeing or not. Is that the simplest iteration, the least amount of work, is just putting it in the existing database as a separate schema that will cause your team the least amount of work? You're on mute.
Thanks. Yeah, that's the simplest version. That doesn't require a heap of re-architecting the solution, or, well, it wouldn't require re-architecting necessarily to integrate it fully, but it just means that we then have a bunch of potential issues around naming conventions and changes around stuff like that. So yeah, separate schema would be best. Second best would be that sort of read-only integration with Rails and you know, all the read-only models, and it requires a whole heap of extra maintenance and blah, 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 blah. So yeah.
We can either start a thread on the CEO channel or actually comment in this issue and get Sid's feedback on which direction he would like us to go. And I would recommend the issue so that everyone can see it, because like Alvaro and Andres folks won't be able to see any feedback in the CEO channel. So I would throw out the different work streams that would need to take place, like just kind of a high order of magnitude, how much work it's going to be, and ask Sid feedback on those. Like, is it okay, the simplest path we're talking about, the separate database schema, but it still lives in its own application? Does that still meet our values of single application, single data store? And we can continue the conversation asynchronously rather than trying to set up a time to get Sid involved in this conversation. So if nobody else wants to take it, I certainly can, but Dan, can you add that one?
Yeah, I got it.
Okay, thanks. All right. Go ahead.
And we're at time, Peeps.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say.
Right.
What were you going to say, Andres? You got like a minute and a half.
There is a scalability concern with putting everything into the database, obviously. So a follow-up question, if we wanted to do that, is how do we deal with the fact that this database is growing and seeing a lot more traffic, because we don't have the ability to put that in separate databases, but put everything into the same database, adding services using the same database. There's a scalability concern that we have to answer there as well.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, from Sid's perspective, that's what Sharding solves. And if that's not what Sharding solves, then we should find a way to prove that it doesn't.
Yeah.
Okay. Let's, yeah, we'll take that conversation offline, the container registry one. Thank you, Dan. And if there's any other comments or conversations, let's add them in here, and I will follow up asynchronously. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks. All right.